I'm going to talk today about romantic love, psychological liberation, and Parzival and his wife Condwimurs, and Rama and Sita. I've studied the Course in Miracles for 30 years, and if you think of a dry line of spaghetti, one strand of spaghetti, that's time as we understand it from a linear point of view, beginning, middle, end, right? But then if you turn it round, you just have one dot. And that's like really helpful as an analogy to think about how judgments in the dream psychological realm, in the psychological realm of this existence, of this identity that you subscribe to, that I subscribe to. There's someone talking, you're watching on a screen. Two different states, two different entities. And I might say something and you can say, oh, that's wrong, and you may be right. But the thing that's wrong could be factual, it could be a mistake in something I say, or it could be a misperception in my mind or yours, and then the correction of that is this loop of the tiny mad idea that you or I or anyone else out there is not worthy of love. And this is the profound psychology of the Course in Miracles. But when I read the Course in Miracles, it's in a Christian language, right? And I'm not a Christian. A lot of the things in the Christian world, they seem to be about guilt. Jesus died for our sins and all this. He's a historical figure. We have no way of knowing because it's so far in the distant past of time, of what we've been reported to have been happening at that time is true, and then there's so many different interpretations. And so the irony of the Course in Miracles is that for me, my teacher, he knew Mother Teresa, he met with her, and like the old model of religion, sacrificing oneself for others in a very visceral, physical way, the way she did, we kind of think of that as a religious person. But to me, like, the embodiment of spiritual enlightenment, of psychological intelligence and wisdom and advancement is definitely Ramana Maharshi. There's no one I've come across in my life of traveling the earth that comes close in that way, and I'm not putting him on a pedestal. I don't see any benefit to that or putting people down, but what I see is, well, what's he saying? Like Joseph Campbell said, the study of mythology is the study of what's talking, right? So in the myth, what is the archetype, what is the character? And in the myth of your own life, when you say something, I hate this person, or I love this, what is talking, right? And it's an affinity with a certain thought system within you, and that's what myths are about. And I think, one of the things that I've lived a long time in Asia, and I've lived a long time in the West, like 2/3 of my life in Europe and the United States and South America, and then 1/3 of my life in Asia so far. And not so much China, but definitely India and a lot of the other Asian cultures. Marriage is a function of the family, of the larger family unit. Whereas from the 12th century onwards, and in the aristocracy to a degree before that, but from the 12th century onwards, in Europe, particularly starting in the south of France, you have these Sufi mystics wandering through Provence. And at that time, you had the liege lord model, which, when Prince William bowed down to King Charles in his ceremony, he said, I devote myself to you, my liege lord. But back in the day, just as India was like a conglomeration of kingly states, tiny little kingdoms which the British unified into. There was no such thing as the Indian subcontinent, or Bharat, the Indian country that we see today. But back in the day, there was all these tiny little kingdoms, like the Sheriff of Nottingham, and there were lords that had control over counties, and then this was all over Europe, right? And it was all over the world, really. And the liege lord was the king, the local king, and then there were knights under him, and then in his court there were troubadours and there were jesters, right? And these archetypes of the jesters and the troubadours are really interesting, because the troubadour was the one that would sing the song, right? And if you look at Indian music, all that music is about the divine. It's not about, it's about heroes getting closer to the divine. But in European music, when the Sufis wandered through Provence in the 12th century, they were like, oh my God, the God is in everything, God is in the trees, and because God is in my mind, the beloved is everywhere. And the troubadours heard this, and they were sort of like the first Beatles in a way, and like, what did you say, mate? Did you say God is in everything? Yeah, everything. I'm doing a silly Indian accent, and no meant to. And I find the humor in Indian culture is so rich, and that's not like trying to put India down. It's like, in a day in India, I would go from immense frustration to incredible hilarity. The extremes in a culture like India, especially when you're a stranger in a strange land, trying to get very small to your cultural influences and appreciate the value of seeing the world through other cultural influences. That's the huge benefit of living in such different cultures, is that you start to realize that the person you take yourself to be is such a conditioned program, and you sort of humble yourself. And I often, I'd meet these Americans in South Korea, and they'd be like, assume that everyone spoke English, and assume that everyone understood the world the way they saw it. And my father had a friend who was a river pilot in Saudi Arabia, and he spent a long time there and made a lot of money. And he didn't have any connection with the culture. There was no denuding. There was no process where he just lived in his bubble, And I definitely didn't live in my bubble. I lived in the mirror of my challenges with looking at my own culture, which India gave me. It really helped me look at okay, that's just one way of seeing. And so back in the 12th century, the troubadours came in, they said, she loves me, yeah, 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 with a love like that. Okay, that's the Beatles, right? But what the troubadours were doing was they took the Madonna out of the church. And in the myth of Rama and Sita, right, Sita is stolen, but his duty is to his wife. But his ultimate duty is, because in that myth, Vishnu is an incarnation of, Rama is an incarnation of Vishnu, which is one of the three fundamental gods of Indian Hindu culture. And he's in this position where his wife is taken by Ravana, who's this great being, but he's gone over to the dark side, if you like. And really, that's a meditation on Indian marriage, and what, it's like, we're here to have babies and raise a family and take care of our older parents, and have a job, and so he's really showing, in the most horrific situation where maybe the side of your mind that hates your wife or hates your husband, that dark shadow nature that Carl Jung focused his life on to a great degree, takes away the love from the story and attacks the best in the things you cherish the most, your family. He's having to look at that challenge in himself, because everything is you pushed out, right? And so if you see people as less than, or you're better than, or you're not as good as, you're living in this projection of your mind. And so here he is facing these projections. Here he is handling the worst thing that could happen to him, his wife being stolen, when he's doing the right virtuous thing. And he has to rise to the occasion, and he does. And that's the story of Rama. And it's like, how do you live in this society where your parents and an astrologer and you come to a decision about who you're going to marry. And that's like pre-12th century Europe. If you're a blacksmith, you marry a blacksmith's daughter. If you're a king, you marry, the daughter of a king somewhere else. And so that was how the nobility worked. That was how everyone worked. But then the 12th century in France, in Provence, this sudden idea that like we won't put God and the goddesses of the Greek pantheon and so forth on a pedestal. We won't put any of those characters on a pedestal. We'll see them in our own nature, right? And we'll follow the impulses of our nature, and we'll decide like she's the one for me or he's the one for me. And so the whole romantic myth came about. And there's 1% divorce rate in India. There's 51% divorce rate at the moment in California, 52% in New York, 42% in England. So that means, you've got a lot of broken homes, 1 in 2. And then you imagine, like, if that's the statistics around divorce, well, how many people are handling serious challenges in their relationships? And people say, well, you're trying to promote arranged marriages and say India's better than... No, I'm not. I'm saying, like, there's a different paradigm operating there, and I have a lot of compassion for both sides, right? And I would say that my experience in Indian culture is that, generally speaking, Indian children grow up in a far more emotionally... This is my experience, I can't prove it, it's not a statistic, but in a far more emotionally balanced environment, with aunts and uncles and all these people around, because the family is key there. That's the old model, right? And the new model is this romantic model where we challenge the authorities of the church, and the church can be corrupt, and there's a lot of wisdom in that often. And we also say, well, you have a divine nature, which you do, right? And so Parzival and the myth of Isolde and Tristan and Isolde, these two myths particularly, as well as Aphrodite and the Psyche, these myths help us navigate the landscape of this Western culture, which is about what Jung called the id, which is what I prefer, right? Not what the society wants of me, but what I as an individual prefer. And if you go to America from Europe, or it's really apparent, like, follow your bliss, follow your dream. And that's a very dangerous path, because 1, your dream can change, and 2, you can fall, you go into a realm where you're not supported by the outside world, where your family, like, it's all me and mine, all about me and myself. And so there you are, you find sexual attraction to this partner, you have a baby, and boom, there's a divorce. And then you have to somehow limp through. And so you have this proliferation of broken homes, you have this spiraling out of control of OnlyFans, and then you have women getting older, not being able to do things like that, and you have this whole culture of, like, the out of balance energy, and there was a movie produced a few years ago called Kayanaskatsi, and it means out of balance, and it's just about, like, the schizophrenic world we live in. Well, it's only schizophrenic in appearances. All of that schizophrenia, all of that, like, psychosis is in the mind, and that's why mythology is so important. And the Course in Miracles as a teaching, I find, is such a profound teaching, because the irony, as I said, is that it's a Christian language, but if you want to go to look for the perfect teacher of this by example, I feel it's Ramana Maharshi, And I was studying yoga in India, and it was like, whenever you go beyond the family unit, right? And in the family unit, there can be petty tyrants, right? Wherever there's power and responsibility, the shadow side of that is that there's a danger that you will overlook the onus of rising above this great weight, this great onus is there to rise above the dark side of your character. And when you go above the family unit, suddenly, you have churches, and you can have, or schools, and you can have a corrupt teacher or principal or priest. And so the more people, or in a corporation, the more people that you have authority over, the more danger there is of, and you see this with the spiritual teachers, like they decide to shun the family unit, and they go off and they form a monastery, and suddenly, like, those basic dynamics where you need the masculine and feminine in alignment, dancing together, gets amplified, the same challenge is there, but then you're not necessarily nurturing a family, you're nurturing a flock, you're nurturing a group, and all the things that are unhealed in your mind will get amplified, as well as all the good things, you know. So you have, wherever you go, whatever level of unity and community you find yourself at, you're always going to be looking in the mirror of the fears that you haven't managed to stare down yet, you know. And so with Parzival, he comes along at a time where we've moved into this perspective where I can choose my mate, and my inclination is to go with the one that resonates with my way of seeing the world. And the way you see the world will change over time, and they might not have the same changes in your partner as you do. But what's so powerful about Condwimurs and Parzival in a way is that they're the model of not the right marriage, but the right marriage of the androgyny in a man or a woman. So it's not like the story of Parzival and Condwimurs is not about he and she. It's about the dance of he and she and he, so that he can be in alignment with she. And it's about the dance of the alignment of he and she, right? So that's the big message. Like, if a woman doesn't listen to her masculine side in a mature way, she becomes walked all over. And if a man doesn't listen to his feminine side in a mature way, he becomes a brute and insensitive. And so, but the myth of Rama and Sita versus Parzival and Condwimurs is that this is a marriage in both cases, and it's a marriage that's involved with, as all marriages are, in looking at the difference in the archetypes within us and around us, and honoring the different elements of gender in those stories. But Parzival is in a culture where we've walked away from the ritual old world of the temple and all of that stuff, and we've said, well, we'll bring heaven to earth, and we'll bring hell too when it goes wrong, you know. And you just, like, it's interesting, if you've watched the movie Mr. and Mrs. Smith with Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, here's two sort of knightly characters, right? She's this feminine character, she doesn't have a child yet, or may never have one, and he's like this masculine knight on doing his deeds. And you see in the way she looks at him all the flaws that a woman sees in a man, right? They start off and they're like this really happy couple, but you meet them in the story of their journey, like several years in, like 5 or 6 years into their relationship, and all the cracks are there. You know, when Joseph Campbell first met his Jean Erdman, his wife, you know, he couldn't do any wrong, and then a few weeks in, you know, she's like the backseat driver correcting everything he's doing. And a woman will put a man on a pedestal until she starts to see his shortcomings, and a man will do the same. And then you've got to handle the war of these differences of, like, you should be this way, and, you know, I think Einstein said, a man doesn't want a woman to change, and a woman wants a man to change, right? So he wants this beautiful young woman that he falls in love with, doughy-eyed, and she wants him to constantly improve and look at the things that are blocking him. And so you really see that in the movie, and then it's an all-out war if you're not careful, right? And that's what he and she becomes, and that's actually what Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's real life marriage ended up being. And all of us are handling these challenges. Just, you know, celebrities like that are just so much in the public eye, and they've got these huge followings, and like, you really, that's back to the jester, because if you don't have the jester in the court of the king of your life, or the queen of your life, that says, I'm going to laugh at your folly, right? I'm going to laugh at the blind spots. And laughing is the right word, because if I say to you something that's critical, you'll take it very personally, most likely, as would I, and it's difficult. But if you can step back and say, oh my God, that's my ego, you know, and then ingrain that lesson into your way of being, the things that are tripping you up, you're beginning to see them in a lighter way, and you can laugh at them. And so that's the whole story of, like, you know, up against the power of the king in the court of medieval time, there was only one man that could laugh at the king, and that was the jester. And if we don't listen to that character, you know, in the Course in Miracles it says, religion is remembering to laugh, or, you know, the lightness of being against the heaviness of ego's self-importance and insecurity. They're always dancing together. And so I was talking with a friend this morning about how Helen Schuckman, the woman that wrote the Course in Miracles, and my teacher that taught it, Tara Singh, they both had a lot of admiration for Mother Teresa, and Tara Singh actually met Mother Teresa on the website of Joseph Plant Foundation, which is still going. There's a picture of him sitting with Mother Teresa, and of course we have this idea that she was, you know, this perfect saint, but really, you know, she went through a lot of dark nights of the soul, and she did a lot of karma yoga, which was about acting to improve the world and to serve God, which came from a pure heart for sure. But I don't think she's an exemplary model for the Course in Miracles teaching at all, because the Course in Miracles teaching is saying, look, you believe you're human, you believe you will be born, you were born, you will live, and you will die. And so when I think of the Course in Miracles, it's really Ramana Maharshi. Like, and he's not, like, the Course in Miracles is in a Christian language, and he doesn't ever mention in any of his stuff, like, this Christian philosophy is just not there. But he's living the truth of what's being said in the Course in Miracles, because in India there's this word jnana, right? And we get the word gnosis, which is knowledge of your divine nature. And you look at Ramana and there's just no, like the troubadours are looking for the divine goddess, right? And they put this woman on a pedestal, and when it first started out, they weren't even, like, it would be like the troubadour would choose a lady of the court, and then he would just write love poems to her, and he would never have sex with her. There would never be consummation of the marriage or anything. Well, he wouldn't even be married to her. But that went on for a few decades, and then it started to shift, and then, you know, the attraction of the hormones and the generative organs would just boom, and romantic love took off. But at the beginning it was like, I'm going to sit here and worship your beauty. And, you know, that was a hellfire time, so there was a belief that if you broke the rules of the religious edicts, you would go to hell and burn for all time. And, you know, that was the philosophy of the day. So to break those rules and say, well, I'm gonna for this one moment of eternal love with this beautiful woman, I will sacrifice everything. And that's the thought that is at the heart of the romantic condition. Like, I will bring you flowers, I will worship at your divine nature, and, you know, your beauty is just transcendent to me. And who couldn't fall for that? You know, it's a wonderful idea, and it's brought out, you know, all the pop music of the world. It's like, it's basically two songs. It's one, You're So Perfect, or like, I'm looking at your shadow and you cheated on me and you're a bastard. And it's like these, and there's a female version of that and there's a male version of that. And he's got to be so strong, he's got to have big blue eyes, you know. And so we make this ideal of the romantic vision. But with Ramana, it was like, he's dabbling with this same foray into the divine energy, but he's saying, look, from the perspective of what the Course in Miracles says, this whole idea that you're a body, that you're born, that you live and die, is an idea rooted in an illusion. And so the real divine shift is to sort of say, you know, where I have defenses, where I have attack thoughts, where I have judgments, I'm caught in the trap of fear. And so when you cut through this, it's like there's a theory in mathematics about, like, we live in a four-dimensional world, right? So there's the flat axis, the up axis, and the across axis, and then there's time. And in mathematics there's this theory called the flat world, which is just like there's only a dimension of, like, flatness, right? There's no up. and there's a crossness, so there's two dimensions. There's like going that way and going that way and going that way, right? So where it's so if someone comes from a third dimensional world, you just see a slither of them, right? So you can't fathom something above or below. And a Nani is someone that says this flat world is an illusion. There's just a vertical world. That there's no time, there's no space, and the illusion of judgment traps you in attack thoughts and defense thoughts, and an identity that is rooted in this realm, this illusionary flat realm of fear. And so, Mother Teresa, I can't fault what she did, but she was helping lots of people. But I don't think she was necessarily a representative of enlightened thinking. She was a representative of karma yoga and service and kindness and devotion to an ideal, in her case Jesus. But Ramana Maharshi was a man that was but definitely demonstrating that there's a way of being that transcends the trap of the dream of the body and the ego thought system. And that's why he's such an interesting character, because that doesn't happen in this world very often. Like, if the story of Jesus is true, then he was also a Nani, right? And he said, look, wherever there's an ego, there's a scapegoat. There's always a need to see what is in us pushed out. So in us is this belief that we're sinners, that we're guilty, that we're not worthy of love, that there's lack. And we've manifested a whole universe to project that into form. And so the focus of like the Course in Miracles and Ramana Maharshi is to embrace a faith in unseen forces based on a thought system that is not rooted in fear and lack. And that's a very humble process, right? And it's also a very, very difficult process, because everything our senses report to us appear to reinforce the lies of the ego. And so it does take developing spiritual sight, right? Looking at situations, looking at the thought system behind our decisions, to start to see things very differently. And the fruit of that process is peace. And so that was my brief meditation on the challenges of the cultural differences in our world. And you really can't underestimate the differences, like in the model of Rama and Sita and Parzival and Condwimurs. And you can't separate Parzival and Condwimurs from the myth of Tristan and Isolde, because in the romantic myth, in Tristan and Isolde, there's two Isoldes. There's Isolde, the queen, and there's the Isolde of the fair hands, right? And in the Indians don't have this problem so much, because Isolde, the queen, is the goddess that you put on the pedestal. Like, she's perfect and I will devote myself to her, right? Which is what all women want, and men have their own version of that. And that is the challenge, that these women, this couple, the man and the woman, Tristan and Isolde, they drink this potion, this love potion, and they fall in love with, like, the moment you drink it, whoever you're with, you fall in love with, right? And it's a curse, because it's like a divine love, and it's almost impossible to, like, it's just like you can't. It's a beautiful curse, right? In a way, but you can't go into a relationship like that. The Course in Miracles does not talk about perfect teachers. It says the people that teach the course here, that are interested in devoting their lives to this, are imperfect. But this is the realm of imperfection. And as you go further and further down, breaking down the illusions of your delusional thinking, you become closer and closer to your true identity. And then, like, as is the case in mythic stories, like the hero Tristan gets banished from his love. She's betrothed to King Mark, and that's his uncle, and he has devotion to him. And the perfect happily ever after marriage ending that we dream of in the romantic myth isn't possible, because he gets outcast and he goes and meets a knight in France, and the sister of this knight is called Isolde of the Fair Hands, and she's good at weaving and sewing, and she's a very practical woman. She's not this divine, queen that is served by the angels and, in the court, and everyone looks up to her and she can do no wrong, like, Prince William's wife, or it doesn't live in this gilded cage. She doesn't just have to turn up and look beautiful and be this perfect mother, but she has to earn a living. She has to pull her weight in the family, just as we all do. And it's not such a romantic, I saw there was an Instagram model from Russia recently. I saw her, she said, "I'm too beautiful to have a job. I don't need to work. I'm just too beautiful." And that's like the narcissism of modern social media. But here was this woman that was a beautiful being, perfectly practical. And Robert A. Johnson described the love between a man and a woman of that level, the practical man, the practical woman, as oatmeal love. It's like getting up in the morning, feeding the kids, going to work, and it's just like the drudgery of life on a certain level. But to get through that with heartfelt moments of gratitude and connection, that's bringing the divine into the world of form. And that was the whole myth of like that came early in the Romantic age. It said, okay, you can have your perfect person on a pedestal. You can have, he's got to be big and strong, he's got to have big blue eyes. You can have all that fantasy world, but you've got to have your roots in the soil of like, well, he's going to have flaws and she's going to have flaws, and I'm going to bring the flaws to the altar of my marriage and work through them. And Carl Jung called that shadow work. But in Indian culture, like, the idea of like the divine pedestal of romantic love isn't really there. They have it in the movies, right? You go see the movie, and like the Indian movies are basically the same over and again. It's like, poor boy falls in love with daughter of rich man says no, bandits come to town, poor boy fights off bandits, saves the village, wins the girl, and that's the whole fantasy myth of the the perfect world. And you, as an Indian, you go and watch those movies, and then you come home and you've got the oatmeal love. Whereas in our culture, like, the fairy tale in the West is far more prevalent, and so the addiction to that belief that it's possible. I mean, I was looking at the life of George Clooney and his wife, Amala, I think her name is, but they've never had an argument, right? But they're movie stars, and that's one in a million. And you're going to come up against, I'm sure that's what they say, but I'm sure with time they will have differences, and here's a big age difference and so forth. The challenge of living, and they've got lots of money, and people fawn over them, and they've got 2 lovely children, and he's got to a level of maturity where he's really happy to live in his castle in Italy, and he just gets fawned on. But the danger of that kind of world is that you're trapped in the ego, and you're not looking at all the darkness in the world and in yourself, and you're burying it. And when you bury it, it's going to come up at some point in some form. So the perfect world of the romantic myth, that's, you can see it with Hitler, right? It was like, we are the Aryan race, we have found a path, we will scapegoat the Jews, and we will scapegoat the homosexuals. And that's a very dark thought system. And it seemed also perfect, like the trains run on time, like the economy started to move forward, because there was this ideal of this Aryan race, this perfect sort of Uberland, Uberman that they were working towards, and anything that got in their way, they would destroy. Well, that's a very dark aspect of the ego thought system, that whenever I think I'm better or worse than you, I will create ramifications in the manifest world that totally disable my better self. And the focus of the Course in Miracles, the focus of Ramana's teaching, is to say, I'm going to look at that dark stuff and I'm going to handle it. And the way I handle it is that I look at a thought system, I invest in a thought system. One could call it forgiveness, gratitude. All of these things have resonance, or viveka in Sanskrit, this discrimination that says, my perception of others reveals my greatest fears about myself, and that's a gift, right? And so if you can look at all your dark thoughts about others, and they may have a lot of truth to them, relatively speaking, right? Someone could be like in a position of a guru, and he doesn't have a jester in his world, right? Because there's no one saying, well, what about this, this thing that this blind spot that you're overlooking, right? And that's the big challenge of being a husband or wife, because like women can be very sensitive about their flaws. Men can be very sensitive about their flaws. And if you don't have that intimacy in the primal relationship of life, which is the husband and wife, because from that comes the family, you have people going away and saying, I'm going to teach the Course in Miracles, and they create these communities, and it's like they put themselves on a pedestal, and there's no one in the jester realm to say, well, you're full of shit, man. I mean, that's what a true friend is about. It's about like, yeah, they'll praise you when you're up, but they will speak the tough truth when you're down. Like, well, what is it that's going on here? What's talking in you? And one of the great teachings and I would say the supreme challenge, and we face it every day, right? It says in the Course in Miracles, I will not give into the temptation of seeing myself as a victim today. And what that means is that you are embarking on the journey of Anani, which is saying that, in the Bhagavad Gita it says, you will do the right act, not for the fruit, but for the action itself. And the Stoics in Greece, they had the same attitude, right? Because you get attached to the fruit, you get attached to your wife's happy mood, or you get attached, and when she really needs to hear something that isn't very pleasant about herself, then you nurture the narcissistic, fearful victim mind, right? And so that's the danger of romantic love. Narcissus stared into the pond and fell in love with himself. And when you don't do romantic love right, you can't handle, like my last wife, she was a 7 in the Enneatype, and Enneatype is, there's 9 inflections of the ego character, and you see this all over the world, and they're based on the 9 sins, the 7 sins in the Bible, and vanity and fear. And 7 is gluttony, right? So I want more and more experiences of pleasure. And so what you find with the 7 character is a lot of laughter, a lot of fun, right? But life is not all about fun. There's a lot of suffering that you have to process, and if you don't do it in a mature way, that stuff comes up and bites you on the ass, And so that's was the challenge in my relationship with her, because she was a very pretty woman, and when things went wrong, she could just run off and use that beauty to capture more men, right? And that's the whole OnlyFans thing, When I look at that, is this pandemic of single parent families. And so what do? You tend to lean onto the things that is your greatest strength in the world, and the world rewards that. And so if we're not careful, we're so moving far out of alignment of our deeper needs in a psycho-spiritual way. And that's the great power and the mystery and the tonic of these teachings of Ramana Maharshi and the Course in Miracles, because they're asking only one question. And that question is, are you interested in ending suffering in your life? Which means you have to end the self-concept, right? And so the thing that gets offended, the thing that can't take humble criticism, the thing that undermines dignity, the thing that supports hate, all these dark things that need to be brought up and forgiven and not judged in oneself and others. That is why, Mother Teresa was always seeking approval from the external God, rather than, I'm not judging anything she did, I'm just looking at how she operated, and we put her on this pedestal. Whereas Ramana is saying, look, it's not about fixing the world, it's about understanding your perception of the world so it can be corrected. And that's not a doing, it's like when you look at an optical illusion that has 2 different images, the old woman and the young woman, it's just like the lens shifts doesn't, there's no, like, you're not like switching on a computer or digging a hole. There's just a shift, right, in the way you perceive reality. And from that flowers a totally different physicality, and you're not tempted to be a victim of the world you see, right? And so the supreme challenge in Buddhism, the supreme challenge in the Course in Miracles is anger is never justified, right? Anger is a prison that the ego would have you trapped in, right? So whenever I see a frustration coming up in me, I'm like, okay, that's the ego thought system. And sometimes it just needs to like get cried out, right? But as maturity does its job, the peace of your real nature starts to come through. And someone I know on social media the other day, they said, oh, you know, I've had a really shitty day and so forth. And like, and I said, you know, sorry about that. And they then came back to me and said, what makes you think I had a shitty day? And they said it in public, right? So like, what you have to realize is that the thought system of the ego is so needing scapegoats and defense and attack. And there's a sure sign that one is deluded and trapped in suffering when those are what are governing your thought system. Now, if someone abuses you, that doesn't mean you don't take them to court, right? They've abused your sovereignty. Like that's there is a good reason for the court system in that relative sense. But at a deeper sense, are you seeing the murder of your child as the personification of evil? Or are you seeing them as a reflection of your belief system that needs healing, wherein the condemnation and the fear and the anger that amasses to get projected on someone like that, who's obviously not in their right mind, is a gift for your own process of undoing the fearful thoughts that make you a prisoner here in this moment.